Now we're starting our session about Creating the China Giant by Albert Cadle, advisor to the US government on China's economy, followed by a discussion with Mohammad Shihab, managing director of Marsec Egypt C20. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My topic is the Chinese state enterprise system reforms. And in a way, the state enterprises reflect the vast change in the Chinese economy over 35 years. So I'm going to, do that. Now, the Chinese state enterprise reform have had dramatic change, but the change was really concentrated in about 10 years. From 1996 or so until about 2005. Nevertheless, there's some important preparations that reflect the difficulties that they faced and the ways that they moved the whole system forward to make it really highly profitable and, just as important, to meet a lot of the non-market needs or the long-term development needs of the Chinese economy. So this is just a quick chronology. They completely dominated the economy in 1980, shortly after the death of Mao Zedong. In the 1980s, as you'll see, there were some preparations that ended rather badly in the Tiananmen incident, which was really a worker rebellion against the reforms and the reforms' impact on the subsidized standard of living of the state enterprise employees. So beginning in the 1990s, there were certain steps taken that set the scene and made it really necessary to reform the system. So there was no argument anymore. In a way, it kind of tricked a lot of the employees and staff into accepting the dramatic reforms. Then they sold off a large number of the small and medium-sized firms and kept the larger ones and began to reform the way that they were operated. So let's quickly take a look at some of that. You can see here quickly in that first column the share of the labor force that was in the state-owned enterprises, and it dropped from a quarter of the whole labor force, including the rural areas. So it was basically the whole urban labor force had dropped to below 10% by 2012, and it's still stayed at that level about now. So this is a dramatic reduction in the employment level in the state enterprises. More than 50 million employees were no longer in the state enterprise system after it had gone on. I'm going to, because of time, skip a few of these. This just shows that the private sector is really what grew so fast, but the state enterprises that were left after the reforms were the very large ones and the ones that were so highly profitable. Oh, this is my old presentation. So I sent in a new one. This one, I have 15 points I'll make rather quickly. They don't seem to have the revised version here. But in the 1980s, there were some preparations, and in the light of what we heard this morning, one of the most important was to reform the higher education system. It had been a traditional Bachelor of Arts university system, and in the mid-1980s, they dramatically changed it to make shorter-term training sessions, things that they said would help the development of the economy. Many more technical positions in university. They cut down and stopped the traditional ivory tower work and created much larger numbers of graduates of short-term programs that they felt would be able to help the economy. And that much later provided a labor force that could handle a lot of the management needs that they had. But when they tried to introduce a lot of the reforms to raise the productivity, there were essentially urban riots and rebellions. And this ended rather badly in 1989 with the Tiananmen-related deaths, which was really, I was there doing work for the Ministry of Agriculture. It was not so much a democracy movement as it was a rebellion against the impact of reforms on the standard of living of the subsidized urban state employment community. In the early 1990s, what they did was to reform the prices of food so the cost of living went up, and then they required all state enterprises to raise wages to meet that cost. And as a result, the financial situation of state enterprises plummeted, and the loss-making enterprise numbers increased, and they were publicized heavily in the newspapers. So the climate was created that these are terribly inefficient enterprises, and they need to be fixed. And then in the late 90s, they began to close them, and they did what was called and this was the core of the enterprise. This was my third point. They sold off the small and medium-sized enterprises. And in the large ones, they did one of two or three things. If they had a good product, then they looked to see if it had high debt indebtedness to the banks or whether it was overstaffed. If it was overstaffed, they laid off a lot of workers, which was, again, very problematic in terms of social unrest. If they had bank loans that they couldn't pay, then they forgave those loans and had a whole restructuring of the banks. So my fourth point is that this state enterprise reforms, because of the financial implications, also required a recapitalization of their whole banking system. So you couldn't, they're intimately connected, the finances of the state enterprise system and the banking system. And the interesting thing is that this was all domestic money. The Chinese didn't use international money. They didn't use international portfolio investments. They had a closed capital account. And that way they had much more flexibility with what they could do in terms of recapitalizing the banks. And these were long-term obligations that were eventually acquired by the central bank, which is not independent in China. So you had a combination of reforms in the enterprise level and major reforms in the banking system. The fifth point I want to make is that they introduced what they call the corporation law and began requiring all of these enterprises that used to be governed by administrative units within the government, all to acquire modern corporate structures. So they would have a board of directors, board of overseers, and they would have internal corrections to management on a modern corporate scale. It was a 1993 law implemented in 1994 and then began to be applied, but it brought out the difference between ownership and control, because most of these large state enterprises were owned by the state, but they had controlling interests by different provinces. And it depended on who put money into the enterprise to begin with, they had the controlling interest. And there are 31 provinces in China. And I attended some closed-door planning commission meetings. I speak Chinese, and this was in the mid-90s, and I was living in Beijing, where they were trying to sort out how do we corporatize these entities that had partial control by different provinces. So it was quite a complex notion of using the corporate structure with different shares to find who the members of the board of directors were, and then have them decide on management. So you began to get emphasis on profitability and cost related from boards of directors and boards of overseers onto management that was hired by the board of directors rather than being appointed by government agencies. So it was a dramatic shift both in the number of enterprises, which were much smaller and now the larger, most strategic ones, but given a profit-oriented incentive that had a lot of bite to it. Number 6, they had to fight corruption. And so we've seen in China waves beginning in the 1990s, the 2000s, and most recently again another wave of institutions of arresting, punishing, or disciplining in other ways officials that are in these state enterprises. And we've seen in some cases they were executed if, for example, their malfeasance led to pharmaceuticals that were dysfunctional and that killed people. But we've seen a lot in petroleum, we've seen in the railroad industry, the arrest of major senior officials, and in many cases these officials have a rank within the government of a ministerial level. So we're seeing continued efforts, and right now under the new president Xi Jinping, another push to hit top targets in the country for their corruption, and that then helps enforcement of anti-corruption methods. And so the idea is that you've got to arrest people, and you have to punish them and make it visible, and the Chinese have been doing that. Points number 7 and 8 have to do with the overstaffing of the state enterprise system and the repercussions of laying off so many workers. In the overstaffing, that was handled heavily by the new corporate structure. which evaluated both leadership and management and also staff for their performance. And so you saw quite a bit of restructuring within these enterprises. And on the worker level, these reforms over this 10-year period caused enormous disruption in terms of urban violence, unrest, street demonstrations. Local government offices would be occupied, there would be sit-ins, there would be blocking of factory entrances that had been sold to somebody else. And so the Chinese have had to develop techniques for managing the social unrest. How do you handle large street demonstrations? And there's really a two-pronged approach. You have to make sure that you cap the violence as soon as you can. One. Two, you have to look at the underlying problem that caused the unrest, and in this case it was unemployment by and large. They introduced a three-tiered social safety net system, so that in the beginning when you lost your job, you didn't really lose it. You kept your affiliation with the company, you just lost your position in the company. And then you were retrained for other work, and when you got that job, you could not go back to your former company if you lost it. Then you got unemployment insurance, and if that ran out, then you got a minimum life support as an urban resident. So they rather complex solution to the layoff problem, but addressing the underlying anger that was so difficult. My ninth point is that one of the ways that they then began to ensure profitability, in addition to the corporate structure and the reduction in staff, was through competition. There's competition between state enterprises, there's competition with foreign-funded enterprises, even if it's a minority stakeholding, and there's competition with the private sector, where some very large firms grew to be quite large in the private sector and competed with the state-owned enterprise. So that you had a need on the part of the corporate governance system, this corporate structure, to make sure that their company was at a competitive level with others. And that was really quite effective. Number 10, they upgraded their technologies. And here again we get to, just as the Chinese didn't have an open capital account, they didn't rely on foreign money at all for the major core of their investments. In terms of technology, they relied a bit on their trade management system, in which they restricted, heavily discouraged the importation of any consumer goods. So if you look at the line items of their customs statistics, you see very small items for consumer goods coming in, whether it's manufactured goods or foods. None of those are imported. The big, thick lines on their imports are all technology, machinery and equipment, and in some cases also feedstock for chemicals that they couldn't produce themselves. But you had the gearing of the whole economy towards technology acquisition, often in the form of equipment, but also, and in particular, during the Great Recession, during the financial crisis, acquisition of skilled labor that was unemployed around the world. Whether you're a German car battery maker or an engineer, the Chinese were hiring them when they were laid off during the Great Recession. So that there's a conscious effort to acquire technology, but maintain control by and large at home. And finally, the technology acquisition included welcoming foreign direct investment, in many cases greenfield, so wholly owned foreign companies, but they were foreign ownership of assets in China, factories, and by and large, or in some cases agricultural facilities, so that you couldn't cash it out. In other words, these again were the closed capital account, but you hired Chinese managers, you hired Chinese labor, and very often then there would be a rapid turnover, as those that were trained in management on the joint venture or in the wholly owned foreign company would then go to work in a Chinese state enterprise. So you got this transfer of management technology as well. And therefore, number 11, as a consequence of all these steps, profitability naturally improved, so that you got very good profit results eventually in these retained. Although I have to say, in terms of the rate of return on assets, a number of researchers have pointed out that the rate of return on assets in state enterprises is it's lower than the rate of return on private sector. And therefore the argument is that you need to sell off these state enterprises, which the Chinese even most recently has confirmed they're not going to do anytime soon. So the profitability also has to do with, these are firms that are naturally profitable because the prices can be influenced. Petroleum. There are also new industries, for example, telecommunications. China has several state-owned cell phone companies, and they compete quite a bit, and they're really quite profitable. As you know, the penetration within China of digital devices is very strong. So profitability is important. My 12th point is probably the key point for my talk about why we're seeing so much profitability within the state enterprise system in China. And it has to do with the health of the overall Chinese economy. The overall Chinese economy has grown over the last 20 years between 8 and 10% a year. It's down to 7% now. And this constant demand, maintained demand, it's called the counter-cyclical capabilities of the Chinese macroeconomic process, has allowed them, when there's a growth slump or a foreign trade slump or a financial crisis, to use domestic resources. China has never been export-led. It's only relied on domestic demand and its own macroeconomic policies to govern domestic demand to fuel its growth. And so they've been able to sustain high levels of GDP demand. And that has enormously positive consequences for innovation. If you're growing and you know you're going to be growing in the future, that your innovation has a chance of success, it's going to proliferate just that much more, and there's more of an incentive to grow. So the Chinese have used the financial system. A lot of this investment is not from the budget. It's in off-budget entities that then borrow from the financial system. And the borrowings come from state banks, some non-state banks and foreign banks, but the catalyst is the State Development Bank, which lends to a lot of strategic off-budget things around the country, a lot of local infrastructure projects, education projects, so that the investment level in China, as I mentioned in a question this morning, is very high in China. And it's over 40% of GDP. And that means that the whole economy grows. If you have a capital output ratio that is functioning the way most do, you have growth between 8 and 12%. And if the whole economy is growing at 8 or 12%, consumption is also growing at 8 or 12%, which means demand for consumer goods is growing very fast. So we're seeing in China this growth engine having a huge influence on innovation, a huge influence on profitability of the state enterprise, and also they have used this to earn foreign exchange, so that they have the foreign exchange that these state enterprises can now go outside of China and purchase assets on the global asset market. So the foreign exchange, a lot of people would say in the United States, Treasury Department, for example, has to do with their exchange rate being unfair. It's clearly not the case. The U.S. trade deficit is because the U.S. prints U.S. dollars and spends them. But the Chinese foreign exchange reserves that become available to the state enterprise system are almost wholly the result of their assembly trade, which is contractually a profit-making and a foreign exchange earning business. You import goods, you process them, and you export them again. You have a surplus. You export at a value greater than the parts and kits that you imported. And if you look at the Chinese data, which are reported along those lines, whether it's the assembly trade or the domestic trade has a deficit. But the assembly trade has a huge surplus because it's contractually necessary that happen. And so then China has amassed really significant foreign exchange reserves, which are then available to the state enterprises to acquire assets and to acquire facilities and factories around the world. So just, I can't emphasize enough how the Chinese management of the overall economy, based on effective demand, backstopped and supported the health of their state-owned enterprises and the profitability of the state-owned enterprises. Number 13, I want to point out that the state enterprises are probably not going to be privatized anytime soon, although many foreigners, and particularly in America, would like to see that, because they play non-market roles. They're used to make sure that in the future bottlenecks won't appear very quickly as the economy grows fast, whether they be transport bottlenecks or it's manufacturing or industrial raw materials bottlenecks. And they have a current job of helping out with local government public goods supplies as they were needed. So the SOE plays a core role in the economy. It's not there will be changes, but the major SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are going to remain in effect for quite a long time, doing a special role for a very rapidly growing economy. As I mentioned before, the rates of return are a little lower, but you don't necessarily want to read that as inefficiency because they're providing non-market contributions to the overall real economy that don't necessarily show up as financial returns. And China is now expanding emphasis on its services sector, so we will probably see some previously dominated sectors, such as tourism, will become increasingly privatized, but that won't be the case for most of these large strategic state enterprises. And so my final point is that there is no sort of magic wand that China used to sort of make its state enterprises profitable. There's a whole complex process that involves limiting the scale of the enterprises, encasing them in a corporate structure where profitability is really the key criterion for evaluation of management and staff, and having honest mechanisms to control corruption. And one of the most important of these is that China has a very strong and very independent accounting program to do investigations so that they can do credible look at the degree to which the finances of a particular company or a particular local government have been undermined by corruption. And they rely on that quite a bit, and it's also quite important. So, no magic wand, a complex process, a long historical period that really had its roots in the 1980s when a lot of things were still too early to change without having an explosion of social unrest. And then in the 1990s, the creation of an environment of clear, heavy losses that then inspired dramatic change in the state enterprise system, selling off of the small and medium ones, and introduction of these profit-based criteria that resulted in the firing or the replacement of many positions in management. And finally, now we're seeing more and more consolidation as the mergers and acquisitions of state enterprises continue to strengthen their corporate structures. So no magic wand, no quick, easy fix, but a very real set of steps that you can use to make a state enterprise system profitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kidal. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that we in Egypt as well, we look at the Chinese model of growth and specifically, you mentioned that it started in 1980 and effectively 1979, 1980. And if we reflect on the state of our public enterprise, it appears very similar to how things used to be in China prior. So we are ridden with a lot of loss-making state-owned enterprises here as well, and very vibrant discussions on how to take these forward. In my business, we're dealing with the business in the shipping container industry. We're dealing a lot in business with China, and China currently is amongst the top 3 trading partners, and in imports it's actually number 1. And through that we also get to interact a lot with that. Before leaving the panel to the people to ask questions, maybe I had a couple of questions and maybe make a couple of comments myself. I mean, the Chinese state-owned enterprises right now sit at 155,000, but the top 113 of those contribute a vast majority of the business in the state-owned enterprises in China. Amongst the top 500 Fortune 500 companies, we've got 44 of those, and 4 of those are in the top 10. Maybe starting off and kicking off with a point that you mentioned about the state-owned enterprises not that the government now is facilitating competition. A lot of these state-owned enterprises are still in industries that are shielded from competition. Do you see that continues to be the case, or is the Chinese government moving more towards a liberal economic system?
Well, when we say shielded, you mean shielded from foreign competition. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in having foreign firms, for example, in the financial sector or in other service sectors, having foreign firms able to compete on a level playing field basis within China. It will happen gradually. The Chinese are fans of an economist in the early 19th century named Friedrich List, who pointed out that if you open yourself up too quickly, your own industries don't have time to develop. So very strong sense that appropriate protectionism, for example, in the cinema, film industry, will allow your own industry to gain in sophistication rather than just being washed over by imports that are much more sophisticated and lower cost. So that way of thinking is quite strong in China. And it was also strong in South Korea, strong in Japan. These economies that have successfully grown have done so by allowing their own domestic firms to become adequately sophisticated to be able to compete globally. So you're going to continue to see resistance in China to quick opening. And so there now is a negotiation with a bilateral investment treaty between the United States and China. But the U.S. would want a number of controls on that, requiring open playing field. But for the Chinese, the criterion is not open level playing field, not equal treatment on both sides. That's not the Chinese idea. The Chinese idea, we should agree to something that is optimal for Chinese development. Full stop.
I think one of the points that I reflected most in your speech is how you mentioned that the Chinese development was over cycles, and you mentioned the 1980s being somewhat socially painful, and then throughout the 90s things started taking a different shape. Do you, and I think if we reflect also in Egypt, a big part of the hesitation or the reluctance to make a lot of these changes is fear of that initial phase. How do you find that the Chinese government dealt with it beyond simply a heavy hand? Was there other policies, social betterment policies that enabled them to do this better or easier? And reflecting on how they transitioned from that phase in the 80s to a different phase in the 90s as well. What can we learn here in Egypt from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the Chinese had two experiences of social violence that were terrible. One was the Cultural Revolution, in which there was open warfare between groups, and children killed their school teachers. It was just horrible violence of a rage against authority. And the second was in Beijing in 1989, when you had such dissatisfaction in the urban areas with basically what they saw as their poverty, but they didn't realize that they were heavily subsidized compared to the rest of the country. So they didn't know how privileged they were, and they just felt it wasn't fair, and they ended up, starting to kill soldiers themselves in that terrible couple of days there. And students, didn't get killed. They negotiated a way out. It was really an urban worker fight, and it was so bad. And it was facilitated by a split in the government. There was a government leader who was using the demonstrations to advance his own purposes, and that was a big issue. But as a result of those two events, the Chinese are very sensitive to the danger of social eruption. But they separate out situations where there are real complaints about having lost a job, or you had to move your house because of renovation in the urban areas. And in those cases, they set up whole systems to deal with the underlying problem. And I mentioned the social safety net, and that's really quite important to have something in place that you can use to solve the problems that are causing the unrest. And the second thing, for the state enterprises in particular, they really set the stage so that the losses that had been there just became terrible by forcing an end to the food subsidies, grain and cooking oil, raised those prices, and then requiring the state enterprises to raise the wages to match. It worsened their profit and loss statements so badly that then they began to publish these in the newspaper and create a climate that we have to have layoff. We cannot, this is not sustainable. And in that political climate, then they introduced and got less resistance than they would have if the economy had been booming. So it was in a relative downturn. Growth slowed down below 8% briefly at that point. In that climate, with these large losses, they had a sort of a politically acceptable argument for moving forward with these reforms.
One of the things you mentioned as well is the governance model of these Chinese state-owned enterprises has been shifted more towards a private sector, KPI-driven and profitability-driven model. It is estimated that 1 out of every 4 state-owned enterprise in China still loses money. So you wouldn't say that it's a full transition into private sector modeling yet.
No. That's right. And some of those, for example, in pharmaceuticals, involve the provision of goods that benefit a large portion of the very poor population. And so that whole process of price reform will take time, and China is still quite a low-income country by my calculation. The World Bank calls it upper middle income, but when you know the levels of poverty in many regions in China, it's still a jury-rigged system in the pricing of certain products, and that has an effect on profitability of state enterprises. So it's also a public good provider, and the reforms that I've described are ongoing.
We've been watching in the news as well how the Chinese stock market shot up late last year into middle this year, and then the bear market came in and shut down. And the Chinese government has also been trying to influence that bear market, specifically through the state-owned enterprises as well, and through certain key players in that, and ultimately not succeeding in stopping the bear market. Do you foresee the trend of the Chinese government involvement and influence over state-owned enterprises and the economy waning?
So is the influence waning? I don't think so. The whole stock market episode is a very interesting one. In my mind, and I have no direct proof, but it just seems to be the case, there's something of an internal struggle on policy involving the pace of financial sector liberalization. And you could see it perhaps as Beijing, where the Planning Commission is, and the government sits with Shanghai, which is the financial center. Shanghai would really like to open up the way their colleagues in the industry all around the world have opened up, and you get a lot of profit based on all the flexibility. The cross-border capital movements, which China still controls heavily, can be very profitable for the industry, but lead to a lot of instability. And so in that situation, one of the things that the financial industry may have wanted and did want was more liberalized margin purchasing capabilities, so that if you wanted to buy a stock, you could borrow from your broker to buy the stock. And last year, the government began to make extra liquidity available to retail brokers to lend money to their retail clients to buy stocks, so that you had this huge artificial surge in the price of stocks in China. And then it was a bubble, and it finally popped. And so the government then was in a difficult situation. I would argue that the popping of that bubble was helpful to those that think we need to proceed more slowly. It was an example of how this can hurt a lot of small investors, those that were unsophisticated. The sophisticated people got out early, but the unsophisticated first-time investors lost a lot of money. And so from the government's point of view, this is just a sign of how dangerous this is, and we really shouldn't move in this direction. It hurts too many people. But they can't be seen as uncaring or ineffectual, so they had to make an effort to try to stop it. And a lot of my financial sector friends say, how silly, the government really shouldn't interfere at all. But in fact, in many cases, the financial industry doesn't have either the national economy or the global economy best interests at hand. The fluctuation in either direction is good for the industry up to a certain point until they need to be bailed out by a government. So I think that the Chinese will continue to have a strong hand in the financial industry and in state-owned enterprises in general, because it's still what we call a second-best economy. In economics, there's a famous theorem in the 1950s that said if you don't have all the conditions ripe for markets to solve your problems, reading market signals can send you in the wrong direction. It's a very famous but now undertaught principle of economics. But the bottom line is you can't trust markets that much. You need hands-on knowledge about what's really going on. And so I think that's really the philosophy of the Chinese government. This is such a complex, imperfect market that they have in their economy. We need to maintain a regulatory and an oversight role to have the whole system work well. If you leave it to a liberalized system, you're going to have fluctuations that in the long run could be very damaging.
My final question before leaving this to the ground would take a point from one of the previous panelists when they said that in order for government reform to take place, first and foremost, you need to have the political will within the government. So if we reflect back to when these reform policies started in China in 1979, how would you define this manifestation of this political will, and how did it start? And specifically with all the painful decisions and actions that needed to take place in order to fight corruption, and you mentioned it went up all the way to executions. So how did this political will gather in China?
Well, I think you have to bring in the word leadership. When the Chinese economy became independent in 1949, it was a mess. Civil war, foreign occupation. And it started out with a 5-year plan with a lot of Soviet assistance because the US in the Korean War cut them off completely. And the US then opened them up in the 1970s, so it wasn't that China closed itself. But by the time you got to the 1970s, you'd had implemented a radical system of serfs in the rural areas on communes and a heavily state-structured manufacturing enterprise in the cities with a separate population registration there that gave you cradle-to-grave privileges. So you really had an anti-market system in the extreme. And at the same time, you had a group of leaders that had tried to introduce reforms in the early 1960s and been swept away by Mao Zedong. And some would say because he saw the presence of U.S. troops in Vietnam and felt that there would be war with the Soviet Union, and so they moved a lot of industry into the interior. It's very bad locations. But the result of that whole process in the 60s of that early phase was a highly inefficient economy based on an unproductive serf-based agriculture, and these reformers from the 60s were all in jail, including Deng Xiaoping, and a leading economist named Chen Yun. He wasn't in jail, but they were in house arrest or had no role. And so when Mao died, it took them a few years to get back in power and to engineer these changes. But I mean, Deng, as a young man, lived in Paris, after all. So he knew, once you've been to Paris, you can't take them back. And so they began to change, but with a strong idea that we need to have a mixed market economy with leadership of our party, because if you don't have leadership, it'll fall apart into inefficiency. And so that germ of an idea that we want a market economy that's with a lot of leadership, and how do we do that? We'll do it in practical ways, however we can figure it out, was the philosophy and the spirit that led them through. But it meant you don't have an open capital account with portfolio flows coming and going. You manage your trade. You use government spending to maintain demand, and a number of other economic development processes, including close management of the financial system. You don't have an independent central bank. And with that set of tools for leadership, then they were able to succeed. It's dangerous. It depends on, is that leadership benevolent or is it malevolent? And that's a risk. If it's malevolent, you're going to have a terrible kleptocracy. But in China's case, it seems to have been, as far as the economy is concerned, benevolent, because it had such rapid growth and directed at the rural population, which is what the cities didn't like. So the cities blow up. They're still angry. I have friends in the cities who say, why are we giving so much money to these peasants? We need more money here in the cities. But the government has said, no, we want to build a middle class. It has to have more equality. And so you have more and more rural people moving into cities, getting jobs. That creates the long-term basis for stability. So I would say it's leadership that is focused in a benevolent way on the development of the whole economy.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Albert. Can you please shed more light on how the import regulation set, or this policy that was set by the government, what were the immediate and long-term effects, please?
Well, that's a great question because China also acceded to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization, in 2001, and probably one of the most imposing sets of requirements. The control on imports, of course, began right at the beginning. They had a very regulated trading system. Their price system at home was so different from the global price system that everything went through trading companies. But their policy was, we're not going to rely on imports for consumption goods. No discussion. We need foreign technology. And until they began to earn more foreign exchange, there was a real shortage of foreign exchange. So the strategy of importing technology and not importing consumer goods is there right from the beginning, even to the point of not importing grain, even though that's they have to keep a lot of land producing grain that should be in vegetables and fruits where it earns much more money. But they don't want to import that much grain, although that's changed recently a bit for animal feed. But for fine grains, for wheat and rice, very little importation. When they joined the WTO, it wasn't so easy to just slap on a lot of tariffs or quantitative barriers. And so they had protected themselves in some ways in the WTO accession, but there are also a number of methods that a lot of countries used, and particularly Japan and Korea have used them also, for phytohealth reasons or other kinds of technical reasons to avoid importing consumer goods. And the other issue is that with the assembly trade, many of the world's consumer goods are produced in China. And so they're sold in China as well, but they're produced in China with Chinese jobs and Chinese joint ventures that are assembling or putting together or just packaging in some cases these products. You know, the iPhone is put together in China, but China has a trade deficit with the US because the parts that they import from the US have a higher value than all the value that the Chinese add to the iPhone in assembling it. So that combination has allowed them to really restrict or not require such a large importation. But you know, Russia, one of the problems they have, they got used to importing American chickens. Now the Chinese, I have to say, the Chinese love chicken feet. So they import a lot of American chicken feet, but there's not a lot of demand for that anywhere else in the world. So it's a good question, but it involves a lot of sort of technical and backhanded or underhanded ways of just limiting the importation of consumer goods. So it's a great question. You ought to go to China and ask them how to do it.
Hello? Hi. Mr. Kaido, can you please maybe just elaborate a bit more on the state-owned enterprises? And I'm keen to understand more about which ones survived, and the ones that survived, were they because they were the ones that were profitable, or were they the ones that were strategically important to stay state-owned? And in the transformation from losses to profits, how much of that were they privatized? Was the management changed? You said ownership versus management. So did they put in professional management in place? How did the transformation take place? You said layoffs with safety nets, which was very interesting. How long did that take? Just, you know, was it sort of a revolution or was it an evolution? It's really interesting to understand more about that space.
Well, yes, thank you for that question. And it's really the subject of the topic. When the Chinese went through the core of the reforms in the late 1990s, they had a phrase which was called 抓大放小, to grab the large and drop off the small. And that meant that they were going to just sell off or get rid of or close a lot of small enterprises. But they were going to seize or grab hold of the very large enterprises. And so what were state enterprises now, the large number of them, the vast majority in number terms, are now private enterprises. And the large ones, to answer your first question, were seized mainly because they were strategic. And they were seen as something that the government wanted to make sure was farsighted in its investment scale, so that, there are a lot of complaints that Chinese have much more steel capacity than they need, overcapacity. Well, there are two issues there. One is that some of the capacity is old, very poor quality, but the other is that in 3 years, they'll need it. And if you look at per capita steel production, compare it with South Korea and so forth, you see they're still way far behind on a per capita basis. So how they then managed the profitability, it began really in the 1980s when everything was run by municipal or county bureaus. So these are government agencies that would decide how to expand the firm and what to do with it. In the company itself, all you had was engineers who knew how the equipment worked and make it go. So they began in 1984-85 with something called a factory manager responsibility system, where they allowed local factories and other firms to advertise and hire a manager that could make their operation profitable. And the problem there was also that there's a second dual source of authority in Chinese enterprises, and that's the Communist Party. The party has a secretary of the local secretary of the Communist Party committee in each enterprise. And in most cases, the party secretary in a factory or in a company outranks the president in the party. They have a ranking. And so you had like a dual system of control, the party and the management. And that also was quite effective because the party acted a bit as a success enforcer and disciplined the whole operation. But beginning with that factory management responsibility system, they realized that, okay, if you hire a factory manager and say, make profits, they'll run down your assets. And it's not a very long-term sustainable operation. So then they began adding criteria. And pretty soon they realized that a lot of these makeshift management systems aren't adequate. You really need to introduce the full-blown corporate structure with oversight from boards of directors and supervision by boards of supervisors and outside directors. And so that finally was all passed in a law in 1993, began operation in 1994, and then began to be applied to all of these state-owned enterprises, which again, as I said, took quite a bit of time because of their complexity of control and investment histories. And it really is that system then that gradually over time allowed them to improve their profitability, including reducing their staff. In the actual reform period, they had these criteria. If you had losses, if you had a good product that had some sales, even if you had losses and no profits, they were interested in you, in keeping you. But they wanted to look at why you had losses. And if you had losses because your debt service was so high, then they forgave you your loans. And that was part of the bank recapitalization process, because then the banks had bad assets that suddenly disappeared, so they had to replenish the assets on the bank's balance sheets. So that was one way. If you were loss-making because you just had this inherited labor force, permanent lifetime employment that you couldn't do anything about, then they implemented layoff programs with a social safety net. And so with that system in place, it took about 10 years for that to work its way through in an initial pass. And once it was passed through, you had a core of large strategic steel, shipbuilding, telecommunications, electric power, all of the major sectors that they felt, if in the future we continue to grow fast, if these aren't there in time with capacity, we'll have bottlenecks and inflation, and we'll have to slow our growth down. So there's a long-term effort to make sure we don't run into those bottlenecks if we continue to grow so rapidly. And I think that, therefore, what looks like perhaps a poor financial performance for some of them is, in fact, the price that they're willing to pay to have capacity in the future. So it's this far-sighted dimension of leadership that is represented in the state-owned enterprise system. At least this is my picture of it.
We have time for one more question. Please.
China, Project Spark in China helps in this reforming?
The Project Spark in China is the idea that a single spark can light a prairie fire. And it's therefore an innovation project, and it's more motivational with a lot of seed money going into smaller enterprises, because one of the major reasons for difficulties in the 1980s was this sudden appearance of a large number of rural enterprises that weren't part of the state enterprise system at all. And I worked on projects beginning in 1981, 82, 83 in a lot of rural areas in China that were doing textiles. There were dairy factories, shoe factories, leather goods, a whole bunch of things that began to compete with urban factories and underprice them. So the spark, it's an old phrase by Mao, began to be applied in ways to support a lot of these smaller initiatives. And it also would support technical change, but it's a pretty broad-based program. I don't have a lot of detailed history for it, but yeah, it's again an effort to promote small-scale startups that can eventually grow very rapidly. Good question.
Oh, one more.
No. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dr. Kato. Can you hear? Okay, great. There are lots of media reports about in China about multinationals leaving China and setting up plants, let's say, in India, Southeast Asia. And the reports have a very pessimistic tone about China no longer being competitive in manufacturing. But I'm curious to know your observation of that phenomena. That is that true? Is that trend sustained or sustainable of leaving China for cheaper cost, lower cost nations to set up manufacturing facilities?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It is sustainable. In fact, it's necessary. The Chinese first put a pilot program in action in 2008 to restructure a lot of the coastal industries, particularly in South China, Guangdong and Fujian provinces, because they were too dirty, too labor intensive, not sophisticated enough, and they needed to be sunset. That China's standard of living, and therefore the cost of its labor, was rising. And so the Chinese have a plan to phase them out. And the Chinese themselves are moving them to Africa and other places. And the idea is to move up the product life cycle ladder. And the product life cycle is an old theory from Harvard Business School, I guess in the early 60s, that said a product has a life that begins when it's first invented and needs to be close to its market, needs to be produced by engineers that are changing its design. But after it becomes standardized, and after its production process becomes standardized, it can move to distant locations, use less skilled labor. And so what we see in most developing countries, they're producing old industries, old products, the most typical of which is textiles. So in many poor developing countries, since it's such a standard product, the earliest industrial revolution product, the textile industry is easy to implement. You move up the product difficulty ladder, you get to, for example, computer chips. Well, in the 1980s, South Korea was learning how to package memory chips together, but it couldn't do processor chips. And that's the same now. Processor chips are developing so fast, they need to be in Silicon Valley or in other locations where you're right on top of the engineers. So the Chinese idea is that we're ready now for more sophisticated products that require more skilled labor, and that can therefore earn a better wage. And so as a process of the whole economy developing, they want to get rid of a lot of these very low-end assembly kinds of jobs that don't allow them to pay their workers that much more. But it's quite common to hear these stories about China's unsustainable, that it's not going to do well, and you have a lot of TV programs in America showing empty home developments and so forth. I've looked into who's writing those, and they often don't have much of a China background, but they're closely affiliated with the financial industries. And I think there's a huge market in derivatives that will insure your Fortune 500 company against a crash in China. But in order to sell that, you need to encourage stories about a coming crash in China. And then you can make a lot of money as a financial sector. Now, that's just a hunch I have based on this pattern that I see, but it's repeated over and over again. So my view is to be rather cynical about these stories of a coming China crash, particularly if I can trace them back to some consulting firm working for the financial industry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time.
Thank you. So, thank you, Mr. Keidel, for the informative session. Thank you so much. And thank you for literally walking us through creating the China giant, literally. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mohammed Shahab, for moderating the conversation. It was too rich and informative. Thank you so much.